Hi everybody, it's Whitney here for my March wrap-up. This is a list of all the books I read in March. I have been trying to do 2 videos per month with like all my wrap-up stuff, but this month, since I went on vacation, I didn't really have a chance to do that, and so there are a whole bunch of books I'm going to be mentioning in this. Some I will try to breeze over to keep the video kind of short, and others I have a lot more to say, so we will see how this goes. So I'm going to start the video off by talking about the audiobooks I listened to this month. The first one was Tony Hillerman's The Blessing Way, which is part of a mystery series about this Native American sheriff who solves crimes like on or near the reservation. I liked the book. It was a little short and the conclusion felt a little rushed to me, but I really didn't like the narrator, and I think it was because I had had a past experience with this narrator and I didn't realize it until I was about halfway through, and then I finally was like, oh, that's why he's bugging me so much. It's the same guy who did a version of Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and he has this like weird old prospectors kind of voice, which is very off-putting for me. I don't love it. I could see why they'd choose it for something that takes place in the West, but it was just kind of like slow and boring. It's not a great one for running, especially. But the other 2 books that I listened to on audio worked really, really well for exercising. I read the first 2 books in the How to Train Your Dragon series by Cressida Cowell. I guess it's actually by Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III, and it is only translated from the Old Norse by Cressida Cowell. That's the kind of stuff that I really liked in this book. There was stuff that worked on a level for kids, like there are a lot of fart jokes and just some kind of like base humor that I think kids would really respond to. But then there are like puns and meta-narrative things that I think adults would probably really like. I can imagine listening to this series in your car as you're going on a road trip with a bunch of kids. I don't have a bunch of kids, thank God, so I was just listening to it and having a lot of fun. So I listened to How to Train Your Dragon and I listened to How to Be a Pirate on audio. And the first one, I don't remember the narrator. He was really good. The way that he did the voice of the dragons was especially funny, and I loved that. And the second one was narrated by David Tennant, who I have not actually watched in Doctor Who. I hear he's great, and I hear Doctor Who is great, and I know that I need to get on that, but I just watched him in Jessica Jones and he plays the villain, and he was just like excellent. I mean, the characterization of that villain is also just really good, but he was so good, so I was so surprised and excited when he was doing the narration for How to Be a Pirate, and it was great. I think the best thing about that was that he read at a speed that you could listen to. Sometimes these audiobook narrators seem to feel that we cannot pay attention unless they are going like at a slug's pace, but David Tennant actually went at a conversational pace and it just worked very well. Now on to the things that I actually read in physical form. The first thing I read this month was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This I could kind of convince myself was for my studies. I didn't read it during the workday, but I was still like, yes, I'm doing good here by reading this, because it was about superheroes, or just like super people, let's say, and how they use their powers for good or for evil, or whether or not good and evil actually exist as concepts in a world where superhumans can exist. This book was really fast-paced. I think it was meant as a kind of escapism, and it did bring up points that I was interested in as somebody who studies superheroes, but they were also points that have been examined in full before. I think that stories like Watchmen or Kingdom Come have kind of like thought about these issues before, so maybe it wasn't as revolutionary or ingenious as it could have been, but there were still points in it that I liked thinking about, and that helped me think through some of the problems that I'm thinking about in my studies. As part of my effort to read more mysteries this month, I read Dennis Lehane's Kenzie and Gennaro series. I read the first 2 books in that, A Drink Before the War and Darkness Take My Hand. A Drink Before the War was very interested in race and how race looked in a modern Boston setting, and Darkness Take My Hand was more about like a serial killer and police corruption in that same modern Boston setting. I think I'm not mixing up what those 2 things are. I mean, those titles are not great. I really enjoy reading these books partially because of the tone. It adopts this very noir, gritty, just like corrupt and kind of gross, dirty tone that I just thought was like really fun to read. It reminded me of Raymond Chandler, but kind of like pushed up to 11 because of all of the sex and violence and swearing and whatever. So it's like very R-rated and just a very quick read. And I really liked the partnership between Gennaro and Kenzie. One's a woman, one's a man, and like how they sort of like love each other and want each other, but there are obstacles in their path. That seems to be a very common theme in detective stories. I'm reading a few others that also have that kind of a theme, that you can't be a good detective or a detective to the best of your abilities if you're being distracted by love of any kind, and so you have to just form that relationship with your partner. I mean, I think that's part of what Wortham had such a problem with Batman and Robin, right? Like that he felt like they were in love because they couldn't fall in love with other people outside of that partnership. Anyway, these books are fun. I wouldn't say that they are exactly substantial, but they are interesting from a generic point of view. For the Readers Inc. Book Club, hosted by Conrad at The Deckled Edge, I read The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. I have a review for this. I don't really want to get into this again because this book was so complicated and difficult to think through. I liked it, but I didn't. So if you're more curious about what I thought about that, then just check out a link down below somewhere. I'll put the link to my review video. Another mystery that I read this month that I reviewed in a lengthier video was Tana French's Broken Harbor. I really loved this one. The thing that I don't think that I mentioned in my review was just how careful this book is about procedure, which was fascinating. The first 100 pages or so, maybe even longer than that, are all examination of the crime scene, just about the detectives going through room by room and taking note of every single clue that they can find in those rooms, and thinking about how that might fit into a general narrative of the crime. And it is really long. I mean, these pages are not like really wide margins or big fonts, and they spend 100 pages looking through this crime scene, and I just found it so utterly compelling I couldn't put it down. I think I read through that examination of the crime scene in one sitting, hours of reading, because I just wanted to get all of the information. And the last mystery that I got to fit into this month was Knots and Crosses by Ian Rankin. I actually finished this last night. It is the first in his Inspector Rebus series, although I'm not sure, one, if that's how you pronounce his name, Rebus, I'm not sure. I really should look these things up before I sit in front of a video and then project it onto the internet for all to see, but whatever. And also, I don't believe that he is an inspector yet in this book. He seems to be some sort of like sergeant detective. I also don't know anything about ranks in the military or in the police. So with all that in mind, this was interesting. It was definitely a first novel. It's full of typos for one thing, which is so obnoxious. I'm finding so many books lately that are full of typos and I don't know what that is about. Maybe it's me and I am just finding these errors more frequently, but it is full of typos and it's full of like some weird pacing issues, but at the same time I felt like it had so much promise, not just because the character has like a very interesting backstory. He was involved in the armed services and it was not a pleasant involvement, I'll say that. But also I felt like this story was kind of unique because the crime takes a back seat to the characterization. So we get to know Inspector Rebus really well, and the crime is sort of happening in the background, and when it personally affects him, then it becomes important. But for the majority of the novel, it is not the focus, and it is not what pushes the narrative forward, which is so fascinating for a mystery novel. And I think it might have been because I don't think Rankin intended for this to be a kind of generic mystery. I think that he was thinking more along the lines of literary fiction, and it kind of took the shape of a mystery. And I find that interesting because obviously the borders between the literary and the generic are not clear at all, and a lot of people take a lot of issues with even using those terms. And I think that this book is a really good example about how authors can blur the terms and the categories. The next 3 books I read in one weekend. This is our choice for my BFF Book Club this month. It was my best friend's choice, and she chose to read a few books from the Little House series. So we read Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie, and Farmer Boy. So I can talk about these all at once, I think. As a kid, I had read a few of these. I know I had never read Farmer Boy, but I think I read the first 2 and then On the Banks of Plum Creek or something like that. And as a kid, I really remember loving Little House in the Big Woods and this kind of comforting feeling of living in a little house like surrounded by snow. But I don't really have that much memory of reading them. My little sister, I actually borrowed these from her. She was obsessed with these books. She loved historical fiction, and I was more into kind of fantasy stuff, I think, as a kid. And even when I liked historical fiction, I remember really loving like Caddy Woodlawn and Anne of Green Gables, and these characters that I felt were more like feminist, like strong female characters, like we always say. And I didn't really feel that way with Laura and Mary in these books, which makes sense. They're like babies in these books. They're like 6 years old, I think. So, you know, maybe later in the series they become those kinds of women and girls that I was interested in as a child. Reading these now, though, I absolutely loved them. I totally get that comfort feeling. The way that she talks about food is just amazing. Like, as I was reading, I wanted to start all of these projects, and I wanted to churn butter and make my own bread and stuff like that. Stuff that I never do. I'm just gonna buy that from the store, but these books made me want to kind of get in there and produce my own food and kind of live off the land. The way that the books talk about craft, it's so intricate. Honestly, I feel like I could go out and I could build a door for my house without nails now. Now that I've listened to how Pa does it, I think I could do that too. So I'm going to continue reading these, even though that wasn't necessarily part of our book club. I just go through them very fast. I was kind of sick last week, and it was just so comforting to read these books. And I read 2 nonfiction books this month. Actually, I read 3. One was about Batman, and I don't even really want to mention the title of that one because it was so bad, but I suspect it was somebody's like dissertation project, and I understand what that's like. I think people would read mine and not be so impressed at this point, so I don't want to talk bad about like somebody who's already an underdog. But the 2 nonfiction books that I read this month that I absolutely loved was Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. This book has been talked about to death. It is essential reading, according to me and Toni Morrison, by the way, which I think is all the call to action you need to go and read this book. I was on hold for a million months at the library for this one. I finally got it, and I was just blown away by the ideas in this. Some of it I had thought about before, but some of it was just astounding to me that I hadn't thought about it before. Obviously, I'm coming from a place of privilege, and that is probably why I could afford not to think about it. But I think that this would be such a good book to teach in a high school setting or in a like freshman college seminar. I think that it takes a very careful look at Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and other very prominent figures of the civil rights era, and then examines kind of where we've come since then and what we can do with that information. I think one of the most important parts of the book is that he keeps on talking about how some people like to think of themselves as white. Whiteness, just like any other race, is a construct, and it's the people who think of themselves as white, who believe themselves to be white, who can sort of then claim all of the privilege for themselves. So yeah, astounding book. I don't have much to add that people haven't talked about yet, but I will be reading this again, I hope, many times. And the last book that I'm going to talk about in this video was Better for All the World: The Secret History of Forced Sterilization and America's Quest for Racial Purity. As you can tell by the title, quite a heavy read. As I was reading this, I just kept running across facts that I wasn't quite prepared for, and I would like call my husband into the room and just be like, did you know that Americans did this? Did you know that America as a government sanctioned this particular policy? I mean, it is so distressing that we don't teach about these things. At the same time as Germany was experimenting with forced sterilizations and genetic policies that we now find completely horrific, America was experimenting with the exact same things, and it was only in contrast to Germany, who they saw as an enemy, that Americans tried to put a stop to that kind of genetic experimentation. So I talked about this book a little bit in my vacation reads video. I was about halfway through at that point, and I don't have much new to add about this except for the book was very, very interesting. It was written in a really clear, engaging style, so even though it's still kind of academic, and I was reading some complaints on the Goodreads page page about how it feels a little bit dry to people. I did not think that at all. I actually thought it was very interesting, and the way he used case studies to examine the history of eugenics really kept me invested in the actual story of it rather than just the information. Alright, so I warned you that was a very long video. I tried to talk fast and I tried to be more succinct this time to keep it short, but I sure read a whole lot of books in March. I also read a lot of like individual issues of comics. I read like half of the Walking Dead comics, and I am continuing with that series, and it's just been a really good month for reading. So thanks for watching, and I will be looking for your March wrap-up videos. Tell me in the comments if you've read any of these books or if these books remind you of any other books that I should be reading, and see you later.